If we hear about ancient Greece and ancient Rome, then why do we never hear about ancient Persia? Especially if it existed in the same region and time period as the other two civilizations. And it was larger than Rome, controlled 40% of the world's population, and contributed more to science and mathematics than Rome did, but still gets left out of the history books. Well, there are two major Western biases for why we don't hear about it in American school books much. The first bias is just that ancient Persia is modern-day Iran, while ancient Greece and Rome are romanticized as the founders of democracy, American values, and Western values. And the second bias, which is sort of related, is that we mostly just let the ancient Greeks tell us about what Persia was like. But the ancient Greeks were Persia's rival, so of course the Greeks were going to write about how evil and aggressive the Persians were. And it's why we learn a lot more about Alexander the Great conquering Persia than we do about Persia itself. And it's why the most popular movie ever made about Persia in the West is about 300 ultra-masculine Greeks fighting the entire Persian army. But if you look at non-Greek sources, they talk about Persia a lot more positively, where you could actually see Greece being the bad guy and Persia being the good guy. For example, Persia had very little slaves for the time and actually paid their workers for state projects, whereas almost every single thing in ancient Greece was built using slaves, which really isn't an exaggeration. And it's why famous Greek philosophers such as Aristotle and Plato could afford to just spend all day sitting and thinking in the first place. Not only that, but if you look at the way they treated the ethnic groups they conquered, sure, you could say it wasn't right for either of them to conquer and build an empire in the first place, but this is the ancient world. And compared to other ancient empires, the Persians were remarkably humane and tolerant for the time, and historians regard it as the world's first multi-ethnic empire that was peaceful, fair, and prosperous. Whereas the Greeks kind of just treated conquered people like colonies who were inferior. And when it came to women, Persia was again remarkably progressive for its time, as it let women own property, set up businesses, and serve in leadership roles, where one of the wealthiest merchants in Persia was a woman. While Greek philosophers like Aristotle would write about how women are inferior by nature and lacked the rational capacity to rule. And women weren't considered legal people who could sign any form of contract according to Athenian law. Unfortunately, despite how tolerant Persia was, almost none of it gets talked about, which is why I wanted to make a video on it. And sadly, there could actually be a lot more civilizations like this than we think, which we'll never hear about simply because the victors write the history books. For example, we hear all about ancient Rome's accomplishments, but we hear much less about the accomplishments from ancient Rome's rival in North Africa, Carthage. And it's because Carthage lost. So the Romans burned almost every single text from Carthage. And almost everything we know about Carthage today comes from Roman writing, which had a lot of propaganda. So the Carthaginian writing on what really happened in their own civilization's history is now lost forever. And Carthage now is simply modern-day Tunisia, where few people today know that it was once as advanced as Rome. Yet if a few battles went a little bit differently, it could be ancient Rome that we never hear about. So despite all the bias against Persia, things could have been way worse, since Persia did also get most of its own writings burned by Alexander the Great. But we still have some other sources to tell us about Persia today because Persia was just so massive. It controlled 40% of the world's population, so it just wasn't possible to burn every single positive source about Persia around the world. Whereas Carthage wasn't as lucky. See, that's kind of the sad thing about ancient history. If you aren't as massive as Persia, and you're on the losing side, and the victors burn your books so they can rewrite the history books themselves, then a lot of knowledge about your civilization is now lost forever. Humanity will never be able to recover it, it's just impossible. Meaning there could be a lot of other great, thriving civilizations from the past which we will simply never know about.
This video is a characteristic example of modern anti-Western rhetoric. It attempts to deconstruct Greece and Rome in the name of an anti-colonial narrative, but it fails into the same classic error that anyone with eyes to see observes again and again, with different orchestrations each time. Simplification and historical anachronism. So let's deconstruct it. The video begins by saying in the same geographical area and the same period, ignoring that we are talking about civilizations separated by centuries of evolution, of changes and worldview. And it calls this the same geographical area, which he is actually speaking of an expanse covering 2 continents, from Italy to the Aegean and India. If this is the same area, then the entire history of humanity fits on a school map. When you don't understand the flow of time, then time becomes something flat, and then history ceases to be something organic and alive. It becomes an ideological tool for anyone who wants to correct the past with the standards of today. Anachronism and the present in the past. Our friend's mistake here is precisely that. The fundamental mistake is projecting modern values, and modern values as rights and tolerance and democracy, onto societies that operated with an entirely different horizon of meaning. Ancient Persia, Greece, and Rome cannot be compared using 21st century criteria, they cannot even be compared easily with each other. And yes, of course, Persia contributed to science and mathematics, as did Babylon and Egypt and India and China. No serious historian would dispute this. There was an enormous interaction between the Greek and the Persian worlds, and not only that, both commercial and cultural and even philosophical. Greeks traveled to the east to study, and Persians had contacts with Miletos, with Samos, and also traveled to Greece. But to say that Persia offered more to science than Rome or Greece is just an over-exaggeration and an oversimplification. This is not history anymore, it's some kind of a slogan. And one last thing, you talk about the East and Persia, but have you ever read the Chaldean oracles? The Chaldean oracles are a synthesis of Greek, Pythagorean, and Platonic metaphysics with the Persian and Babylonian hieratic tradition. And that is to say, the spiritual space of late antiquity itself is already a mixture. There's no East versus West. This is your modern scenario. It is not theirs. In reality, the relationship was a dynamic cultural synthesis. The Persian Empire, as a colossus, absorbed elements from all the peoples it subjugated. From the Greeks, it took artisans and architects. There are inscriptions found in Sardis and Susa, the two Persian cities, while also Greek scholars and physicians like Diomedes lived and served at the courts of the great kings. And this was happening already from the 5th century and even before that. And even in art, some decorative motifs and depictions show the influence of the Greek naturalistic style. And this exchange was not one-sided. The Persians admired Greek art and thought, and simultaneously, and especially after great Alexander's conquests, the Greeks were impressed by the Persian magnitude of things, the wealth, the magnificence, and this led gradually to a complete fusion. The Greeks of the Hellenistic kingdoms, such as the Seleucids, they lived in a world where Greek and Persian elements merged at every level, not only as simple subjects, but as officials, as physicians, soldiers, scholars in the royal courts themselves. And the history is very, very clear. The interaction was profound and bidirectional. And this is confirming the idea that the East and the West always constituted a unified and interdependent cultural space, and not the way that many view history today. What truly happened during the Persian Wars was a clash of worldviews. It was an ideological conflict. And it wasn't confined between Greeks and Persians necessarily. There was many ancient Greek cities within the territory of the Persian Empire that fought alongside the Persians, not against them. The dispute was a dispute over the perception of life, regardless of whether those perceptions came from Greeks or Persians. Their world bears absolutely no resemblance to our world, none at all. Persia was friendlier to women. This phrase, Persia was more progressive with women, sounds nice in modern moralizing videos, but it is absolutely crude. Persian society was patriarchal. Over the centuries, it actually evolved from matriarchy to patriarchy, and it was a theocracy. And the participation of women in public life depended actually on the dynasty of the era in question and their social class. And exactly the same thing happened in Greece. In the Greek experience of things and the Persian experience of things, the issue is not did they have rights as you define them today. It is, was the woman present as a carrier of the divine and the law within the community? And the answer to that is yes, they were in both cultures. Then you talk about Aristotle, and you ignore that Aristotle was not the Greeks. He was a specific person with a specific viewpoint that was later instrumentalized both by the dogmatic patriarchy of Christianity and later by the cold materialism of the rationalist scientists. Aristotle saw the world through a system of logical order that was based on his philosophy, and he was also misunderstood in a lot of his points. But even this, Aristotle was not the rule of Greece. He was one of Greece's countless philosophers. And nor you can call him a male chauvinist or something with modern terminology. Because other things were also happening in Greece. For example, there was Pythagoras. And Pythagoras had dozens of female students in his school. Then there was Epictetus who spoke of the inner human being. He wasn't talking about gender. And there he was saying the same to a Spartan woman. She would hand down her own child if he did not stand by the Spartan values. The narrative, therefore, that women in Greece had no rights, it is not true. There were priestesses of immense prestige, such as the Pythia of Delphi, Diotima. Diotima was the teacher of Socrates. Then we have the priestesses of Athena, we have the priestesses of Demetra, of Artemis, and others. And they presented the divine in the public sphere. And there were also female philosophers. Theano, who was the student and wife of Pythagoras, and author of On the Cosmos and Numbers, Mia, Fintis, Aspasia, and of course, Hypatia, later on in Alexandria. Some taught in schools, which did not happen in Persia, but women in Persia could also participate in administration and even the army. The fact that we do not have surviving texts from Greek female philosophers, or that we know very little about them, is due to the fact that some people later on made sure of that. The Athenian gender inequality was legal and symbolic, and it was a division of responsibilities, not existential inequality as you understand it. A woman's role was economic and sacred, and was connected with the word ecos, which is the root of economy, and ecumene, which is the whole human civilization. And within the Greek logos, there was complementarity, there was no devaluation. Then you talk about Persia supposedly being left out of school books. But are you under the illusion that Greece is in your school books? You don't find the Greece of Socrates and Herodotus in your school books, but a caricature of Greece that taught you the word democracy, yet a democracy that's totally disconnected from logos and the knowledge of the self. In the same books that made Socrates, the first democrat, and Plato a utopist. This is the Greece, the Greece they show to you. The other Greece, they have long since exiled. Did they ever taught you what Diotima taught Socrates? No. The role of the Greek sources. It is true that most sources on Persia are Greek, but this does not imply propaganda. Aeschylus would probably disagree with you. Or have you never read the play The Persians? Aeschylus did not demonize the Persians. He saw the same human nature in the enemy, and he spoke of Hybris and nomos. Nomos basically is law, but in the Greek understanding of things, it's cause and effect. It's what we call today karma. It's not the good guys and the bad guys. And Aeschylus, who likely lived through the Battle of Salamis, wrote the play just 8 years after the victory. And instead of a maybe expected triumphant tone, the tragedy is set in Susa, in the heart of the Persian Empire, and presents the defeat from the enemy's perspective. The main characters, the chorus of the elders, Queen Atossa, the ghost of Darius and Xerxes, are figures of dignity, of figures that express pain, fear, distraction, and the loss of their homeland. And Xerxes' mother serves as a symbol of the human suffering that is caused by war, regardless of any nationality. It's about the universal tragedy of war. The play does not attribute the defeat to Persian cowardice or Greek superiority. Instead, it elevates it to a metaphysical level, to a metaphysical moral level. And Darius appears as a ghost and explains that the catastrophe was a consequence of Xerxes' hybris, his excessive arrogance and lack of wisdom, which violated the divine and natural laws. And this moral dimension of the play transforms a historical event into a universal myth about man's relationship with fate and the gods. Aeschylus did not demonize the Persians. On the contrary, he presented them as human beings with complex emotions and deep sorrow. This is an unprecedented display of empathy for the defeated enemy in ancient writing. The tragedy does draw a clear contrast between the freedom of Athenians and the despotism of the Persian Empire. And the Greek victory is presented as the salvation of free men. And the victory is attributed in part to divine intervention, and that was to reinforce the Athenians' sense of religious and political self-confidence. And the presentation of the play was sponsored by Pericles, and it came together with the rise of the Athenian hegemony. And the work served also as a praise to the Athenian military and reinforced the Athenian identity as the defender of Greece. Yes, it did that too. The Persians is not just a simple propaganda leaflet. It is a historical drama that uses a political event as a pretext to then develop a timeless moral and psychological lesson about hubris and the divine justice. And the work explores consciousness, the pain of the other. And this was acting as a warning to the Athenian audience itself. Excessive arrogance can bring the same destruction to the victors. Xerxes functions as an anti-model for the Athenians. And was Aeschylus right? Yes, he was right, because the later arrogance of the Athenians brought about the civil war and the Peloponnesian Wars. And this is something that should be a lesson for us today, because we see all over a lot of arrogance and a lot of hubris circulating. And all of that, they always bring their consequences. Aeschylus' tragedy, as a form of the Greek logos, is not limited to national triumphalism, but extends to the understanding of the human nature and the moral laws that govern the universe. Therefore, the work combines the national patriotism of the victory with a deeper philosophical outlook at the human condition and the consequences of arrogance. And this combination is what makes it a prime example of culture and not propaganda. Only someone unfamiliar with the term logos thinks that history is always written with emotional labels. And let's take it to the other side. Have you ever read Thucydides? To see how he speaks of the Greeks themselves in the Peloponnesian War. He doesn't speak with fanaticism, he doesn't speak with heroes, he only speaks truth, and he spares no one, neither the Athenians nor the Spartans. And Thucydides does not merely seek the superficial causes of the war, but the deeper true cause, and this, according to him, was the growth of Athenian power and the fear it instilled in Sparta, leading to war. And he does not praise his own side. He records causality, self-interest, violence, and fear. And he is the first to deconstruct his own era. What he does there is an X-ray of consciousness. This approach is radically different from a fictional or propagandistic explanation. The motives are political and very, very human. Fear, self-interest, violence. And he does not hide the hubris and the greed of the Athenians, and shows the Spartans as they were at that time. At that time, the Spartans were very conservative, very hesitant, very methodical, forced into this war by fear, but also very, very capable and very, very cold warriors. And they were not always like that. Oh, let's go back again. Have you ever read Herodotus? Herodotus had a complex attitude towards the Persians. Well, there was indeed a bias against the main opponent of the Greeks in the Persian Wars. Herodotus does not describe them solely negatively. He gives detailed and complementary descriptions of Persian culture and customs. And regarding the war, his descriptions inevitably present the Persians as the enemy. But Herodotus does not portray them as simply evil. He acknowledges their virtues, their training, their horsemanship, their archery, their arts. And the other thing that says about them is that they are telling the truth, that the Persian value of truthfulness among the Persian people, not necessarily about their leaders, was considered particularly important. A key point of his negative descriptions is Persian arrogance. And this is what Aeschylus also spoke in his tragedy, and Thucydides in his history. For example, Xerxes, his campaign against Greece is presented as a display of excessive ambition and a threat against the Greek freedom, which ultimately leads to his destruction. In summary, while Herodotus was not completely objective, the image he presents of the Persians is much more complex than a simple negative depiction, as you implied in your video. He shows both his admiration for their culture and society and also his criticism of the actions of their rulers and their arrogant behavior. Herodotus, Thucydides, Aeschylus, despite their political positions or any other prejudices, they attempted to understand the other people or the other side of things in terms of culture and consciousness, not hatred. Many Greek philosophers traveled everywhere with curiosity and admiration to understand how other people viewed the world. And if you study ancient Greek histories, you will see, for example, you need to study the etymology of words to understand how they were thinking. The word enemy in Greek, εχθρός, has nothing to do with someone you hate. In Mega Etymologicon, a dictionary, it says that εχθρός is someone who appears in front of you and blocks your flow towards goodness and your free will, kind of, so to speak. Greeks philosophized because they had slaves. The idea that Greek philosophized because they had slaves is a childish historical confusion made by, how to say it, superficial anti-Westerners. Those who philosophized were not wealthy loungers, but people raised in a culture that generated questions. Socrates was not a lord. He was the son of a stonemason, and Herodotus, despite his aristocratic origin, he refused power. Epictetus was a slave. The Pythagoreans lived in communities with austerity, discipline, and inner work. And many Pythagoreans later became active members of society after their training. Years of training. They were stable, unwavering, and resilient people. And they became generals, politicians, artists, and so on. Leonidas didn't do what he did because he was an action hero. He did it because he had this philosophical upbringing. Philosophy was not a luxury. It was the education. And it is called Paideia. And it was the way the Greek was raised, to question, to doubt, to observe the self. Self-knowledge was the Greek religion, so to speak. No one philosophized because they had nothing else to do. They philosophized because they could not help but ask. And since we mentioned Leonidas, you talk about Leonidas and the movie. Have you ever considered perhaps that this movie is a Hollywood product? That the muscle men in it have nothing to do with the philosophical attitude of Sparta? And it wasn't an action hero act, but it was the result of Spartan education. The Spartan Paideia. Every city had a different method to approach it. And in Sparta, it was based on austerity, discipline, and the understanding of the law and the Spartan values. In other words, a form of practical philosophy. Have you ever heard the word philosophy or the word logos mentioned anywhere in the movie 300? Do you even know how much that movie annoyed us in Greece? It was fun to watch, but it still annoyed us. Moreover, slaves in Greece are not comparable to slaves in Rome or the colonial era. In Greece, the slave, doulos, from deo, which means I'm under some kind of bond, which is the modern Greek word for working, is doulevo. It is from the same root, had a legal status. They could buy their freedom and acquire property. And many were prisoners of war, but they were not a human property, like it happened later on in colonies and in the colonies and with Rome. Telemachus in Odyssey calls Evmeus, which is his father's slave, my little father, pateroulimo in Greek. Does that seem like slavery in the classic way we understand it today? Or is it some kind of bond between humans? It was a totally different thing. Greek slavery, yes, was undoubtedly an institution, but its nature was socially and legally much more complex and differentiated than the superficial modern criticisms imply. In Rome, there was chattel slavery, and the slave was ares, which means a thing. In the Middle Ages, there was slavery within theocracy, and we know what happened later on with colonialism. The Greek city-states had social stratification, but the human being never became an object of complete depersonalization. There were laws against it. And now, let me ask you a question. Do you think you are not a slave? Do you not have bonds? Try to stop paying your taxes, to cease obeying the system. You'll see how free you are. You live in a much more sophisticated, much more controlled, a deep form of slavery, but you don't even realize it. And then there is this other form of slavery, which is that of mental bonds. When was the last time you examined all of your beliefs? Which of the things you think, feel, want, and thus do are truly your own, and which are implants or reactions? Modern man lives in the fiercest slavery, but he simply does not see it because he has become a voluntary slave. It's called ethελόδουλος in Greek. Modern man is constantly exposed to a barrage of information, of ideologies and standards that dictate what to think, what to desire through advertising, and how to feel through the media and social media and the educational system itself. Man not only accepts these mandates, but internalizes and defends them as he identifies his security and identity with his submission to the whole system. The inability of modern human beings to question the dominant ideological narratives while constantly being bombarded by desires and emotion is spiritual and psychic slavery, and this is the heaviest form of slavery. If an ancient philosopher came to the present in a time machine or whatever, he would look with confusion and ask, what has happened to you? Persia was tolerant, Greece oppressive. You spoke of the humanism of the Persians. Yes, there was tolerance for their time, but don't forget that it was an empire. Persian tolerance was a tool for the stability of an empire. Subjects did not have political participation. They were subjects to the satrapies with appointed local governors. You paid taxes, you recognized the great king as the representative of God, and you accepted the administrative system of the empire. And revolts were ruthlessly suppressed. And for example, the Ionian Revolt. There is a clay tablet from the Persian archives that mentions 32 units bar, which was the name of the measurement system, 32 units of grain, which Aspasupoutis supplied, were received by Senda, who was the regiment commander in Persepolis, for whom Paideia sets the rations. He, Senda, gave these as rations to Greek women who had recently given birth, in parentheses, in confinement, in Persepolis, irrigation workers whose rations are set by Paideia and Misabanda, 12-month, 22nd year. On the surface, this document is relatively unobjectable. It is just a typical receipt for rations written in the usual style of the Persepolis administrative archives, but upon further examination, the workers in question and the timing become highly significant. The only 22nd year appearing in the Persepolis Fortification Archive, which is called PFA, belongs to the reign of Darius I, and the 12th month of the Persian calendar corresponds to February-March. Therefore, we are referring to early 498 BC, which is precisely during the Ionian Revolt. So while a Greek revolt is in progress, we have a group of Greek women who have recently given birth, yet they are assigned to a forced irrigation work, which is an extremely difficult and strenuous task. They were digging canals. And while rations for women in confinement appear regular in the archive, this type of hard labor does not. And we know from Herodotus that the Persians, the Achaemenids, the dynasty of the Achaemenids, often used deportation as a means of dealing with rebellious people. And both Herodotus and later on the narratives of Alexander the Great's conquests mentioned that some of those displaced Greeks ended up in southern Iran. And also, these specific workers appear to be under the authority of a military commander, that Sheda guy, instead of a regular administrative official. So it is highly probable that these women were prisoners put to forced labor. And let's not characterize them slaves, let's be careful, because it might have been a temporary punishment and not permanent slavery. In Encyclopedia Iranica, there is a little macabre note there. It is written that it's doubtful whether the children they had born were the offspring of husbands. The Persians' main goal was to prevent future revolts in an empire spanning 3 continents. The punishment had to be terrifying enough to serve as an example for all subordinate peoples. That's what empires did, always. Miletos, which was the capital and the symbol of the Ionian Revolution was completely flattened. It was totally destroyed, and its population was either killed or was deported deep into Asia. People could indeed worship their gods, have their own customs, but under the authority of the king who was worshipped as God. And we do not have historical evidence from the Persians because the Persians did not write history. The Egyptians did not write history too, like the Greeks did. The Persians kept meticulous bureaucratic records, and every historical element was some kind of propaganda for the greatness of the king as the representative of Ahura Mazda on earth, of God, that is, and how he defeats all of his opponents. And if he didn't win, it wasn't necessarily recorded. So this is not exactly freedom and tolerance, it is managed tolerance. And the historical reality of the Persian governance, especially towards revolts, was very relentless and brutal. And this explains why the Greeks were so afraid of the possibility of a Persian victory in the subsequent wars. They were terrified about it. What did freedom mean in the Greek cities? In Greece, the city-states, freedom was not a political invention. It was an ontological principle. The citizen was not a subject. They were a participant. The polis was not an empire. It was a community of people, a community of souls that were co-responsible for the goodness of the whole community. And it was a community of free citizens. And this is where the idea first appears that man is not simply something that obeys, but something that co-determines. And in actual reality, this disappears with the decline and fall of the city-states. And this has never existed again since then. And here, it's a very good opportunity to explain the true etymology of the word democracy. Demos, from the, which means earth, and the suffix mos. It is not just people and populace, a mass. It means a collection of people from a specific land with common consciousness. And the root of the word is connected to the land, the common place, and the common consciousness of this particular place. And then we have kratos, from krato, which means I hold, I have power. It is power, ownership, and not only state, material or physical power, but above all, spiritual power. It's the inner ownership. The ownership over the self. So the power to hold yourself. The question I posed a little earlier, which of the things you think, feel, want, and thus do are truly your own, and which are implants or reactions? A free citizen had to prove this. The level of consciousness, of perception and virtue, wisdom, capacity for self-reasoning and self-mastering. Otherwise, they lost the right to vote. They did not have the right to political action in that case. And then there was also the institution of ostracism, which was kind of a security mechanism. If someone became too dangerous to the city, if they were sly, if they were not prone to their emotions, to their desires, if they were self-serving, greedy, cunning, if they had accumulated too much power and wealth and were considered dangerous for the well-being of the polis, they were ostracized. They were sent outside the city for 10 years. And why was that? Because freedom has rules. Otherwise, excessive freedom leads to excessive enslavement in the end. Freedom without measure destroys freedom itself. Because there's one simple rule that we don't get. After so many thousands of years of human evolution, we don't get this simple rule. My liberty stops when your liberty begins. And this, of course, can get very complicated if you start thinking about it. But this is the main principle. If you haven't noticed, we are already living it. Look around you, how they bombard us with desire and emotions. We are in a permanent stimulation of desire and emotion with our consciousness filled with noise, with various ideologies and beliefs, so that we are, in the end, all divided and thrown into vagueness. So we do not have citizens in the city-state understanding of citizens. What we have are consumers of identities, and consumers of identities follow every carrot that is presented to them according to their tastes and according to the false identity they have built around their persona. Such people in the ancient cities, in the city-states, would not even have citizenship. Because without self-mastery, there's no freedom. Today, without self-mastery, there is the rights, which is the right to consume the identity of what you think you are, living inside an illusion that the system itself has cultivated for you to swim in. Do you know how the Jewish synagogues arose? Probably not. From the Greek gymnasia and voulefteria, which were the council houses. The first form of gathering of people around logos, which is proper reasoning, the way harmony works, the way idea works, the way music works, were the Greek theatres and gymnasia. And the synagogues were inspired from that. The word itself, theatron, means the place from which one sees the divine and understands justice. The ending tron means instrument of something. Because the purpose of the theater was not entertainment, it was the soul's education, which was called psychagogia. What I explained before about the Aeschylus, for example. For man to understand his place and his responsibility towards the others, towards nature, towards the cosmos, and primarily towards his own self. Buddhism, do you know where it comes from? Probably not. Does Buddhism have anything to do with the West? Or does it have to do anything with Hellenism? How about Rumi, the great Persian poet who influenced all Muslims? Where was he born? And what was he taught? And why is he called Rumi? Because he lived and taught in the Greek territories of the Eastern Roman Empire. And if you read him, you will think you are reading Plato. Do you have any idea that the Druids of the Celts spoke Greek? It's not me saying it. Julius Caesar writes it in the Commentari Bello Gallico. The Celtic Druids taught the soul as immortal, just like Pythagoras and Plato. How then do you say Western civilization and identify it with Greece? This civilization, the Greek civilization, it's both East and West, and it has a common matrix, which is the Greek logos. And this philosophical matrix is what differentiates Greece from every empire and every institution, whether in the East or in the West. Do you have any idea what peace means? It's from eiro, which is to join, is the state where the parts are connected into unity. And war in Greek is polemos, which is from polos, polarity, palmos, vibration, polarization, conflict, entanglement, not hatred, but unnecessary movement of opposing forces that you need to be aware of. And do you know where you stand between these poles? Do you know what you are saving by making these kind of videos? The Greeks did not see enemies, they saw oppositions within the same whole. And this is civilization, it's not colonialism. The great irony. The great irony is that you claim that history is written by the victors, but you don't realize that the way you view history is precisely the way the victors wrote it. Only 2 to 3% of the texts from the Greeks and the Romans have survived. What happened there? Who rewrote history since then? Let me explain a little bit about what you don't know, since the history you are familiar with and which you even think you are reacting against is already a bubble. The true Persian conquest ultimately did happen over the centuries. But it wasn't only military, it was spiritual. It happened on the level of consciousness. Greece resisted the Persians militarily, but the West later, including Greece, was spiritually subjugated to the exact same pattern. And this came in a stealth mode, through the window, so to speak. Which pattern was that? The pattern of submission, dogma, power, and ruling by the will of God. And this is what essentially plunged us into the Middle Ages. The ancient Greek polis, at its height, was built on the self-activity of the citizen and the responsibility of thought. Every person was a participant in the nous, which is the mind, reason, as a whole, as a unity, as one mind, not a subject of a theocracy. And take out theocracy today and replace it with technocracy. With Christianity, this model of obedience, basically, was essentially introduced to the West. And man is not called to know himself, which is the famous Delphic maxim, know thyself, γνώθεις αυτόν, but instead to submit to a faith that is given to him from somewhere above. Who is above exactly? Isn't this a human creation? Yeah. Maybe there is a God above, but that's a different story. This is the real victory of that Persia over Greece, not the Persian Wars. And I'm not referring to Persia here. I'm referring to this theocratic imposition upon consciousness. And yes, my friend, history is written by the victors. That's why we have phenomena like your video and many others. The West did not inherit Greece. It misunderstood it. So maybe the modern West considers itself the heir of ancient Greece, but it essentially inherited its remnants through a Roman filter and a Christian mediation that is spanning several centuries. So democracy was transformed into a managerial machine of votes that is only democratic in name, while Greek democracy was a way of life. It was not a political system. It was the participation in the truth of the common nous, which is the word for mind, but it's not mind even, it means higher consciousness. So the question was not what political system we have, but who rules? Does the one who should rule, or the one who should not rule? And if we take this question as the Ariadne's thread to escape the labyrinth, unraveling it, every modern ideology collapses. Socialism, communism, democracy, capitalism. That's why you never learn true history. Who looks at who is the one ruling behind all of this? No one does that. Everyone gets lost in their ideologies and beliefs. And all this is noise. Modern rationalism became mechanical logic, detached from what we call wisdom. And when we say wisdom, we mean this participation in the whole. For the Greeks, the logos was not a simple tool. The logos, the logic, it was a cosmic harmony. And you had to bring the way you think to that cosmic harmony. Very similar to Taoism. What does that have to do with modern Western thinking exactly? Atheism, materialism, and nihilism are not currents that arose from Hellenism. They are pathologies of faith, reactions of people rebelling against theocracy, but without ever gaining their connection to the nous, the know thyself, and the wholeness. And this is exactly what Nietzsche had detected. And of course, Nietzsche made a tragic mistake in parallel, but that's not for this video. The West, therefore, did not continue Greece. It misunderstood it, cited it as a symbol, at times ridiculed it and even snobbed it, while in practice the West was built upon this Persian model of power. Greece was always the antipode of dogma and every authority. In Greece, during the peak of the city-states, there was no faith. There was understanding. There was no revelation. There was discovery, and people were truly free. The world was not a creation of God who imposes, but the manifestation of a logos that invites man to participation, regardless of gender, color, or any other division. Like, look around you. We are all boiling in this together. We are all connected. And they knew this. And the barbarian was precisely that. Not only the Greek ethnically, but the one who roughly perceived their existence, who perceives everything only through the senses, without proper reasoning, which is knowing, that's self-knowledge, and the one who lives in separation from nature and from their own very nature, the one who is swept away by their desires and cannot control their emotions, the one who does not understand justice and lives in ambiguity. And this is the one who worships authorities and every kind of authority. And perhaps we, as modern civilization, look more like what I just described. So this logos, which unites being, nature, and man, is the opposite of every system based on obedience. So when faith replaces noises, which is higher thinking, higher reasoning, higher intellect, higher self-awareness and self-knowledge, it's a very hard word to translate, the word noises. It's a word that has nothing to do with what we understand today as rationalism, which is often translated as rationalism. But it's a mind that has been freed from its prejudices. If that doesn't exist, then Greece ceases to exist within a human being, even if he speaks Greek, has Greek descent, or talks about Socrates in universities. And Christianity functioned precisely as the vehicle for this psychology of power. Christianity is not a Greek continuation, but power-grabbing metaphysics that arrived with the Greek language as its tool, and it was refined along the way from people who were seeing what was happening and they were trying to bring some philosophy into it to the limits that it could be refined. It was people who understood what had happened. But what we see today as Christianity was not like that when it started. It was crude, wild, one-sided, unjust, narrow-minded, intolerant, and phobic. The truth is coming out lately. There's a lot of books coming out about what actually happened during the Roman Empire at that time. All the ruins you see in Greece were basically Greece was totally flattened. The type of soul it produced needs a mediator. It needs a priest, a savior, an authority. It relies on emotion and not noises. It seeks salvation instead of knowledge. And when we say knowledge in Greek, which is gnosis, the word, we mean knowledge of how things work in the world around us, and the knowledge of how things work in our inner world, combined. And what is the impact on modern rationalism and scientism? It's exactly the same from a different perspective. We need the expert. Everything we call modern civilization is based on this fragmentation of knowledge and not on its wholeness, the big picture of things. And again, it ends up being salvation, some kind of salvation seeking. And this goes up to transhumanism. That's another material for another video. So, the Greek affirmation of the world was transformed over the centuries into a negation of the world, and self-knowledge was replaced by guilt in the Middle Ages. Diogenes, another philosopher that was not sitting in his luxury lounge, by the way, but he was sleeping in a tub, a barrel, he used to say that when he died, he wanted to be buried upside down. And when people laughed and asked, "Why are you saying this?" he would say, because the world soon, very soon, will turn upside down. And he knew something. From this inverted state, modern West has emerged. It's a pendulum swinging between theocracy and nihilism at the moment, and we need to correct it. The modern West is a post-medieval, post-Christian byproduct. Today's Europe and America and Greece itself are post-Christian, not Greek. The modern ideas of freedom, of the state, of progress, all were born out of the struggle against this medieval priesthood, with whatever they managed to understand back then, 200 years ago, from the Greek texts. It was only a few centuries ago. This didn't happen through any living memory of the Delphic nous, of the Delphic mind. The 147 Delphic maxims were instruction and advice, not commands. Although there were some very cheeky people hanging out. Look up the history of Plethon Gemistos in the 15th century. Because no one talks about him, but maybe you will learn something. And pay attention to the sources, though. What we call philosophy today in the West And the atheism of the West is not a renaissance of philosophy. It is a fatigue of faith. It denies the God of power, but has not regained the logos of being. What I said, yeah, all living in the same system. That's why it leads to nihilism. It created a human being without dogma, but also without nous, disconnected from everything. So your video fails utterly because it confuses cultural progress with moral anachronism, overlooks that the logos and the self-knowledge are Greek creations that have nothing to do with the mentality of the West at the moment. Because you don't understand that the West is no longer Greece. It is some kind of a Christianized state with its own tradition, but it is built upon that foundation. In Greece, reflection was Paideia, that specific Greek education, and it was not a profession. Philosophy was not an ideological luxury. It was the way a human being grew up. Paideia comes from pes, παιδί. It meant cultivation of the soul. It did not mean simple education. To grow up and remain a child, to question and to wonder, not to live psychologically burdened and oppressed and worse off than when you come into this world. Because many people leave this world like that in our times. This is what Paideia means. Paideia is play. Paideia, and then school. School means leisure, scholi. It's the moment you stop your daily routine and play with knowledge and questions about being and about understanding of the self. This is what the word school actually means. Do you have the impression that the word school we use today reflects its original meaning? Or is it perhaps an institution that trains you in obedience? And words are thought. They tell you how people used to think when you start digging into ancient dictionaries. Even the farmer or the craftsman listened to sayings, hymns, poems, proverbs, tragedies. All of those were instruments of self-knowledge that were designed in that way. They were not instruments of religious obedience or obedience to any ideology and various types of institutions that serve anything but the human being. And this was not accidental, of course. The Greek had logos instead of dogma, and his daily practice, his work, his music, his discussions in the agora, in the theater, was an act of self-reflection within the whole. Until they lost it. They lost it after some point, after the Peloponnesian Wars. Self-knowledge was, in a way, our religion, and philosophy was a sacred duty for a citizen. In the Greek tradition, religion is called thriskea, meant reconnection, union. It did not mean submission. It did not mean belief, as it became during the Middle Ages. Etymologically, thriskea comes from Thrax, which is Thracian, because of Orpheus, who was from Thrace, and he was considered the first theologian of Greece, of the Greeks. But if you look at his theology, it is philosophy. He speaks of consciousness. And the Logos was the means of this union. Man he was supposed to mimic the gods and try to achieve all these virtues of the gods, so to speak. He didn't have to believe in them. He had to mimic them. And he had to do this because he understood the way nature, justice, and reality operate. The gods are archetypes. Self-knowledge was a theurgy of the everyday, and man performed the sacred not in temples. It was with his own action, his own thinking. He was trying to approach it. Modern man cannot understand this. He has learned to associate philosophy with something boring and academic. And Paideia is called education, which is connected to professional success, and spirituality is connected to faith or some kind of psychological mysticism, kind of like a new age thing, which is in fashion today. So, the modern human being fails to understand how an entire people, small geographically, limited, could elevate thought into daily practice. Greece did not have philosophers. It was an entire commonwealth of philosophy. Some cities were managing to do it right, some were failing, as I said before, and everything in between. But from the farmer to the playwright, everyone more or less participated in what the Pythagoreans called the catharsis of the mind, which means to get rid of the noise from your mind. Thank you very much. Bye.